hold on. I'm going to stop sharing just for a sec. I don't know if it's recording. It got kind of weird. Oh, no, it is. All right. Yeah.
Oh, there's Lee.
There it is. Okay. Hi, Lee. Oh, you look nice, cozy there. Is that a big cup of tea?
Yes.
Nice. Very nice. All right. Well, welcome everybody to the April, on this Easter weekend, the April meeting of 5 Miles from Everywhere. I'm going to go to present mode, and then I'm going to actually, come on here. Okay, and then I'll actually be switching over to Anne's slideshow in a little bit. There we go. Okay, so so this is kind of a cool meeting because we're not actually doing a Sherlock Holmes story, we're doing a Doyle story. But I think in many ways it led to a very interesting, what you might call mystery. And it kind of started a legend, which is very interesting in my opinion. And in some ways, I think it's unusually one of the more influential of Doyle's stories, even though the influential portion of it was to start a legend, which isn't true. So I think that's kind of cool. Oh, here comes Edith. Okay, so let's start here. So pretty much we're talking today about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the Mary Celeste mystery. I'll give a little brief talk, as I said, and then Anna's going to be our main speaker for today. And she's going to give a phenomenal talk, by the way. She did a really great job, and I can't wait to hear it. So basically, we all know Doyle for this, right? This is why we're here. We all come to see him for Sherlock Holmes. However, there's other things we should know him for. We should know him for this, okay? We really would not have had Karloff and the Mummy was pretty much a ripoff of Doyle's Mummy story, Lot 247, okay? And that's really interesting because before then, before his story, people really looked at mummies as romance figures, okay? And that part is kind of in Karloff's The Mummy a little bit. But really, he was the one who turned into a monster, like a shambling corpse monster. I mean, it wasn't like that before Doyle. And so that's really important, okay?
First walking zombie.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. Obviously, you wouldn't probably have Jurassic Park or things like that without The Lost World. And that one is obviously probably his most well-known work outside of Holmes. So that one he is pretty much well-known for, but very important. And also this, he wrote some strange fiction or what we would call weird fiction in the time period. And some of it is considered influential on H.P. Lovecraft when he did At the Mountains of Madness. So really neat, I think, and then obviously I'm not even mentioning his historical pieces, which is what he got knighted for. Doyle was probably for that time period, that Victorian to Edwardian, that shift, he and Kipling are probably the two most important authors from that time period. Okay, but our focus today is on this, okay, the legend of the Mary Celeste, okay, and J. Habakuk Jephson's statement. So what I want to do, Anna's going to give you a talk about kind of the history and some of the legend. But one of the things that comes up a lot is how could this, how could a very clearly fictional story be interpreted as fact? And part of it, you really have to know how journalism was in this time period, okay? So truth or fiction, a lot of what we're going to look at is, it's reported as truth, but it's clearly fictional. And a lot of what the talk around the Mary Celeste is, okay?
When I first saw truth, I thought it said Trump. Sorry.
and here I was thinking that the lies was Ron's last name, like it was focusing on him. All right. One thing we want to talk about, so journalism in the late 1800s. So the Mary Celeste set sail in 1872, and this is what was known as the end in journalism of what we'd call the party system, okay? And then that is what it sounds like, okay? Newspapers were aligned with a political party. Spin was expected, and you might say, well, it doesn't sound too different than today. Obviously, there's a bent, political bent, whether you're watching CNN or Fox News, there is definitely a bent. But here's where I think is the key, is this part here, that in this time period, there really wasn't a sense of objective journalism like there is today, okay? Like when you read a newspaper, you kind of knew some of what they were saying wasn't true, okay? And that was fine, that was okay, it was expected. So I think that's a huge difference for this time period, and it's easy because of that for things to kind of get mangled. So,
kind of like the New York Times carrying onion articles.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, that's a good example, Larry. Where obviously we read the Onion, know it's fake, but yeah, that's a great one. But the New York Times, one of the most respected.
But if they mixed it in like that,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was working on the book we mentioned at the beginning, The Study in Terror, for my article, I actually interviewed Matthew Goodman. He's written a number of really fascinating nonfiction books, and one of my absolute favorites is called The Sun and the Moon. And so I asked him about this time period, and he said readers weren't looking for newspapers to be objective. They were looking for newspapers which agreed with their own political viewpoint. So this was a time period where you did not have TV, you did not have movies, and people turned to newspapers in part for entertainment. And so part of that entertainment was the occasional hoax or fake news story interwoven in a paper, okay? Like people enjoyed that, they thought it was fun, okay? And probably the most famous case for that is the case of the New York Sun publishing the moon story, okay? And if you don't know the Great Moon Hoax, it was a series of 6 articles in the New York Sun. And they claimed that there was a telescope in Cape Town, South Africa, that they hooked up and they could see life on the moon, okay? And life included, so when you looked at the moon, it was this wonderful land of these bat people, these giant beavers, and oddly enough, common sheep, okay? Like this is what was on the moon. And there was this, like people bought this hook, line, and sinker. There was a big debate, was it true or not? But the author was really clever because he wanted to sell papers with this. And he chose Cape Town, South Africa, because he knew that by the time someone set sail for Cape Town, checked to see if the story was true, and came back to America, they would have published all their articles. They would have sold all their papers. So that was what they were doing there. And so that was a significant, we would nowadays, if people did that, the paper would probably go out of business. People would be angry. They'd get sued. That didn't happen in this time. People ate this up. Another one was from the New York Herald, and they had the Awful Calamity article, another famous one. I don't know what's going on in New York, that these are both New York cases, but there we go. And in this particular one, this is an article that describes the carnage as animals from the Central Park Zoo, they get loose and they kill a lot of people. Okay, like that is this headline, and you can see wild animals broke loose from Central Park. Okay, but the last paragraph says that the entire article is a hoax. It actually ends by saying, oh, and as you know, the entire article isn't true. Okay, and as it does, it's a really fun article to read, and you can find it online anywhere. But as Goodman said, part of the game was for the reader of a paper to try to figure it out. Is this true or is this not true? Okay, like that was kind of fun. And so, really, this is also the time period of P.T. Barnum, and people were enjoying, the humbug. And, when Barnum opened kind of his, I can't remember what it was actually called, but his museum, I guess, of curiosities, one of the ways that he always said he made money is first people would come in and they'd say, wow, this is all true. Then they'd think about it and they'd pay and go back and say, wait a minute, this is all false. And then they'd pay a third time to go in and try to figure out how did he trick them. And so that was one of the reasons why he was so popular. And so again, this is kind of a fun time period because it gave people entertainment to kind of figure out, is this true or is this not? And so as we should do, and what they should have done back then is follow Holmes's advice. It's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories. instead of theories to suit facts. And as we go through here in a minute and see Anna's wonderful presentation, you're going to see how we begin to twist facts to suit theories with the Mary Celeste. And this is how we end up with my absolute favorite Mary Celeste theory, which I just have to share because this is my favorite, that the Daleks killed everyone on the Mary Celeste. That's an actual episode of the first Doctor called The Chase, in which the Daleks show up on the Mary Celeste, they shoot everybody. there's absolutely no burn marks or tire tracks, but anyway, I just think that's classic. So, but now I want to turn it over to Anna, because she's going to give us a wonderful talk here, and it's great. So before I introduce her, before I get her slideshow ready, I do want to introduce Anna. So Anna Behrens, and you can see her in the top right corner there, at least on my screen, she's the top right corner. She holds a degree in medical illustration and a master's in speech language pathology. She is the founder of the Psionic Group, the Monadnock Sherlockians in Keene, New Hampshire, where she holds monthly meetings. She publishes her late husband Richard's Lizzie Borden Girl Detective Mysteries under her imprint Nine Muses books. And I got to tell you, those are awesome. I actually have them right here. And they are, I don't know my thing, but they're delightful, absolutely delightful stories. And in her work as a speech pathologist, she enjoys introducing her middle school students to Sherlock Holmes stories, okay, which is one of the delights. I have the same delight myself. I taught middle school and now I teach high school, and it is fun introducing the students to Sherlock Holmes. All right, so without much further ado, I'm going to share the screen again. Go to, there we are. Okay, and I'll get you to present here. Everyone sees that, I'm assuming?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
Excellent. There we go. All right, and a big round of applause for Anna. Here we go. Let's get, I guess we usually do it at the end, but I'm just so excited about this one. I have to do it again. This is one of my favorite stories to talk about. I love this story.
Well, you're the ringer, Derek, so you can always chime in and add in because you know this better than I do. It looks like the image on mine anyway is cut off on the top and bottom. I don't know. That's true of everyone else.
It on mine too.
That's all right.
Okay, it's not on.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry about that. It's not on mine. So let me see. Are you seeing the full title and bottom?
No,
No.
it wasn't cut off when you had it in the last mode. Then we saw all the slides on the side.
Okay.
Now it is.
that? Is
There.
that better?
Now we see it all.
Okay.
Okay. That's fine.
So I'll do that then, and I'll just kind of scroll through it. That's fine. Okay.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
Anna, you'll
just
have to direct me with the slides here.
Will do. All right. So I wanted to talk about the difference, the facts versus Conan Doyle's fiction in the Mary or the Marie Celeste, as Conan Doyle called the ship. So next slide. Okay, so here are some of the facts, but before I talk about these, I just want to say in my research for this, I've read a lot of different resources, and it's very interesting that some of Arthur Conan Doyle's fiction works its way into factual articles. For example, I just read something that talked about the silk bobbin on the sewing machine being set, and not having fallen off. That's clearly fiction from Conan Doyle, but it was listed as a fact. And there's many other examples of that. So, I kind of gleaned what I could about the facts, but, I think, unfortunately, it's open to interpretation to some degree. So the Mary Celeste was a brigantine. That's the two-masted sailing ship. It was built in Nova Scotia, Canada, and it was called the Amazon, and that was in 1860. Now, it had a very interesting early life. It had a lot of calamities, a lot of problems. Eventually, in 1868, it was the ownership changed to American from Canadian, and it was renamed the Mary Celeste. And some people felt that perhaps this was changed because they thought the ship was jinxed and maybe a new name would help. So in 1872, in a voyage from New York to Genoa, the ship was found abandoned and adrift in the right off the Azores. And it was about a few hundred miles from its last recorded location on December the 5th. The ship was found by the Dei Gratia, and that ship was just followed about a week later, and it knew the Mary Celeste. So it found with the hatches were open, there was some seawater in the hold, the cabins were wet. There was some evidence that the crew had departed hastily. They left their personal effects untouched, and one of the pumps had been disassembled as well. There was nobody found on board, and the single lifeboat was missing. She was very seaworthy, and her cargo completely remained intact. So the Dei Gratia, they split their crew, and they sailed the derelict Mary Celeste 800 miles to Gibraltar. Now, Gibraltar is where the British court was, and the Dei Gratia was a Canadian ship. So they brought it in to collect their insurance money, essentially. So, next slide. Okay, so the captain and the crew, Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs, he was from Marion, Massachusetts. He lived in Rose Cottage, which is pictured there on the right. I actually was in Marion some years ago, and I believe they still have his cottage there, and they have an historical society that has a scale model of the ship. They have information about the Mary Celeste and about Captain Spooner. And it's just a beautiful place. If you're ever in the area, I'd strongly recommend visiting. It's really nice. So Briggs, he was a very experienced captain. He was devoutly Christian. He didn't drink. He even wrote poetry. And he was a new part owner of the Mary Celeste. On his first voyage of the ship, he took his wife and his young daughter, and they did have a son, but they left the son at home because he was at school. The ship was fitted to fit them. They made a bigger cabin for them. And he had a crew of 7. They had a first mate, a second mate, a steward, and as well as 4 German seamen. And the purpose was to transport a cargo of industrial alcohol to Italy. Briggs' tenure as captain was only to last a matter of weeks. This was his first voyage. And his fate and the family and crew remain embroiled in mystery. And they're part of the legend of the ghost ship, which the Mary Celeste is often known as the ghost ship, unfortunately. And the next one, okay, just some images of the Mary Celeste. Interestingly, the Amazon was captured in a painting just a year after it was built in Marseille, France. And to the right, that's the image. And below is a photograph of the Mary Celeste when it was brought into Gibraltar by the Dei Gratia. And next slide. Thank you. So the salvage hearings, when the Dei Gratia brought in the Mary Celeste, I think they were expected the payment for the ship's insurers, but the Attorney General felt like there's something fishy here. So he really took his time and researched all different possibilities. He thought maybe there was a mutiny on board, or there was some piracy, or even Captain Morehouse, who's pictured there on the right, that he was trying to do some insurance fraud to get the money. So after about 3 months, the court didn't have any evidence. So they did allow some payment, but they only paid out 1/6 of what they should have gotten. And then later on in the life of this, the Mary Celeste in 1885, the then skipper, his name was Parker, he deliberately wrecked the ship in insurance fraud. So he was found out and he was arrested, but the ship, of course, was gone at that time. Okay, next slide. Okay. So there's some really incredible theories of this ghost ship. That it was attacked by pirates, but that sort of doesn't make any sense because they left everything on board. The cargo was all there, and or it was abducted by aliens, all the people on board, or they were maybe eaten by sea monsters, or I also put this picture of the skeleton ship. I think that was. I'm not sure if that was a documentary or book or something about the Mary Celeste, but I think there's a lot of like paranormal people who have their own theories about what happened. So all kinds of, and this is just some of those incredible theories. So next slide. So there are some more credible theories of what happened to the Mary Celeste, to the people on board. I think that, to me, this one's the most credible, where they felt that industrial alcohol, which was pretty dangerous to transport, caused problems because there were some that were in a different kind of barrel that was a little more porous, and they felt that noxious fumes came out. And that they were afraid on board that it would explode. So the captain ordered everybody into the lifeboat, and they tethered them to the Mary Celeste, hoping to sort of wait it out. And somehow came untethered, and they were all, lost at sea. But critics of this theory say, well, why would you tether yourself to a ship that's about to explode? That doesn't make any sense. And then others say, oh, there was a big water spout and somehow that was the problem. And then others say, no, it had to do with that pump that was disassembled. There was some faulty sounding equipment, and they thought the ship was taking on water and it was going to sink. So they all abandoned ship. So there are some credible theories, but I think that nobody really knows what happened. But if you want to see, there's a good documentary. Smithsonian made a documentary about what happened. It's called The True Story of the Mary Celeste. And they have a lot of theories, and I think it's well done. If you can find it, I'd recommend watching it. Okay, next slide. So now we get to Conan Doyle's Mary Celeste. He was about 13 years old when the Mary Celeste was found abandoned, and it clearly had a powerful impression on him. He served as a ship surgeon on a whaling boat right out of medical school when he was 20 years old, and then he went on a steamer when he was 23. So he did have a lot of sailing experience. And when he was 25, that is when he wrote this story, J. Habakuk Jephson's statement. It was written anonymously and, published anonymously, I should say, in the Cornhill magazine. And some people thought it was Robert Louis Stevenson who wrote it because it was so well written. In the Smithsonian documentary that I just mentioned, it is stated that they say Conan Doyle later in life regretted writing the story. And then in Brian Hick's book, The Ghost Ship, he says that it was because he felt pity for the Briggs family. He still had a surviving son, and he felt like he shouldn't have written it. So next slide. So now we actually get to his story. I know most of you probably have read it. I was just curious where the name Habakuk came from. And it is a biblical reference. And Habakuk was a prophet distressed about God's inaction in the world. He wanted to see God do something more, particularly in the area of justice for evildoers. And I was just wondering, is that why Conan Doyle chose this name for him? Because he was an abolitionist and was trying to right some of those wrongs. The story is written in the form of a first-person testimony. as a single survivor of the Mary Celeste, although of course it was fictionalized. And we see to the right a picture of the Cornhill magazine where it was first published. So in the story, it's rather gruesome where that most of the crew of the ship were murdered by Septimus Goring. He's a mixed race sailor. His mother was killed and his wife was killed, and he wanted to get revenge against white people. So he definitely murdered a lot of people. And here he took the crew to Africa, and they had tribesmen boarded the ship. They killed everybody except for Jephson, who they take captive. And the only reason they saved him is because he had that odd-shaped charm in his pocket that that they recognized. So they didn't let Goring kill him. So it turns out, as you know in the story, that the charm ends up being the ear to the statue that they worship in Africa. So Goring spares Jephson's life and gives him a ship. So he gets away and he becomes the sole survivor. And this story was written about 3 years before the very first Sherlock Holmes story. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is just some of the differences between the Mary Celeste, which of course is Conan Doyle's version, and then the real Mary Celeste. So the Marie was bound for Lisbon, Portugal, where the Mary Celeste was bound for Genoa. The Marie had Captain Tibbs. The Mary Celeste had Captain Briggs. The Marie had a wife and a 5-year-old son, where the Mary Celeste had the 2-year-old daughter and the wife. The Mary Celeste had Captain Dalton of the Dei Gratia, where Captain Morehouse was on the was the Dei Gratia captain in the Mary Celeste. As I mentioned, that upright bobbin indicated smooth sailing on the Mary Celeste, but of course, we know from the logbook that the Mary Celeste encountered bad storms. The Mary Celeste had 7 hands on board with 2 black seamen and a boy, and the Mary Celeste had a crew of 7, including 4 German sailors. The Mary Celeste definitely had violence and murder on board, but there was no evidence of violence on the Mary Celeste. The Mary Celeste had the lifeboats intact on board. The Mary Celeste, the one lifeboat was missing. And of course, the Mary Celeste had passengers on board, and the Mary Celeste had no passengers.
Oh, okay.
No additional passengers. Also, not sure why, but Conan Doyle put the ship found at a different location, still off the Azores, but just slightly different than the Mary Celeste was actually found. And next slide. So Conan Doyle's influence on the Mary Celeste legend. We know that he was very experienced with sailing, so this really gave his stories realism. He did intend to write a fictional account. He did change many of the facts into fiction, but I think because many of them were so close, like some names were retained, some were very similar to the true story, but for all these reasons, it became treated as fact and made the mystery of the real Mary Celeste well known and still studied to this day. In particular, you can find the spelling Mary Celeste very often as well. I came across that as the real spelling of the Mary Celeste. And we know that's just Doyle's influence. The Cornhill magazine, I think I'd mentioned, because it published its stories anonymously, a lot of people thought the story was fact rather than fiction. And here is a quote from our very own Derek in his great article, "Due to the legend that arose beyond this tale, one can argue that this is Doyle's most influential work." And then in the Smithsonian Magazine, they stated the story of the Mary Celeste might have drifted into history if Conan Doyle hadn't published his statement in 1884. His sensationalist account set off waves of theorizing about the ship's fate. And then in Don Hale's book, Sherlock Holmes and the Ghost Ship Mystery, he wrote, in later years, it had been compared to Orson Welles' War of the Worlds, which I thought was rather dramatic. Okay, and next slide. Okay, and here we are at the end. And this is just some of the resources I used. Derek's wonderful article, if you have a chance, I'd highly recommend reading it. And again, I mentioned the Smithsonian documentary. I think that was very good as well. And of course, the Ghost Ship is a great resource as well, by Brian Hicks. The Sippacan Historical Society in Marion, Massachusetts, they do have this scale model pictured here. As I said, it's a great place to visit if you ever if you're ever in that area. It's a really beautiful town as well. All right, that's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Anna. You know, one other thing I would also add in, just for how did this end up being part of taken as fact, is after Doyle's story was published, the American consulate in England read the story and thought there was obviously anonymous, didn't know who wrote it, and thought there was enough in it to open up an inquiry into the Mary Celeste, like what exactly happened here.
Wow.
And by doing that, you know, people started thinking, oh, well, if they're doing an inquiry in it, this has got to be true. And that's kind of one of the reasons that it kind of slipped in there and got taken more and more as fact. You know, and in my article, I actually have a quote from a newspaper from 1912 that just, you know, mentions the Mary Celeste, and in it they mention some of the things. You know, this is a newspaper, just like, again, as we know from the Mary Celeste, you know, that bobbin, you know, was there. Nothing was out of order, and of course, the big hint is that lifeboat was still there. You know, was still in there.
But still causing confusion even today.
Yeah, well, I will say, even today, though, you know, if you look up the Mary Celeste, as Anna mentioned with that Smithsonian article and other sources, most now people are basing it on fact. I mean, they you know, back in, I think it was 1930, I'd have to go check my sources again, there was a book published about the Mary Celeste, and one guy, all he did was he just went and looked at the records from when it was tugged in to Gibraltar. And it said, and he's like, aha, the lifeboat was missing. He's like, so there is no, you know, the lifeboat's missing. Right. And it was published, and pretty much for the next 50 years, everyone ignored him. It was too cool to have this story where that lifeboat's, you know, missing. I mean, so lifeboat's not missing, you know. Before we started the meeting here, Brian and I were just talking about the In Search of, the old Leonard Nimoy show had an episode in the Mary Celeste, and most of that episode, like, even in that time period, they should have been like, no, this isn't true. Like, it had already been debunked, of course. You know, they had to have the sea monsters and the aliens and all of that. It just makes such a better story. It's so interesting. You know, and even the sea monsters was one theory is why there was so much of that in the late 19th century is newspapers didn't have photos yet. So they loved having these splash pages of sea monsters attacking a ship. It sold papers. So that was one of the reasons that was such a big theory, you know, in the late 19th century about what happened to that ship. Thank you. I find this story really fascinating. You could probably tell because I can't shut up about it. But
I have a question, and I may have gotten this impression from your reading your article, Derek, or other things too. But they keep talking about the change in the spelling of the Marie Celeste to Mary Celeste and back again. And it makes me wonder it makes me wonder if maybe the Marie Celeste was pronounced Mary, or if the Mary Celeste was pronounced Marie, because they only talk about the spelling being. I just wondered about that. When they talk about this a spelling difference, they don't talk about a name change, an actual name change.
I mean, Anna, maybe you could say more, because I don't recall finding too much about it. I just always assumed Doyle wanted to make it clear that it was a fictional story. And so that's why he made a slight change to the spelling. But I don't recall finding anything specifically about that. Did you find anything about the name change?
Not specifically. I just found that, yeah, he wanted to change it slightly, but it is so slight that it's almost like, well,
Do you think you think maybe they pronounced Mary Marie in France, and they pronounced Marie Mary in I don't know.
I would just be speculating.
Yeah.
I don't know.
All right.
Shana, did you want to jump in there, or Shauna?
The whole Mary versus Marie thing reminded me of the Edgar Allan Poe story, the murder of Marie Roget, which was based on a real case of a woman named Mary Rogers.
Correct.
And he like transplanted the events from New York to France and thus changed the spelling and the pronunciation. I have no idea if that was an influence on Conan Doyle when he wrote this story, but it's an intriguing parallel.
Well, he was certainly very influenced by Poe, so it could be.
Yeah.
Mm.
I haven't found any evidence of it, but certainly that makes sense. It's a good theory. So.
And there was also an ancient antagonism between England and France. That one example of it was that Mary, Queen of Scots, was raised in France, and her name was Marie. But when she went to Scotland, Scotland was an ally of France for a long time, and but the English referred to her as Mary, not Marie.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, that makes Mary correct as far as I'm concerned. What did you make of the, and it's just mentioned, but no more. How about the sword that had been wiped? I mean, was that a Doyleism?
Yes. Or was that? I'm trying to remember.
Why? What was it wiped? What was on there?
I'm trying to remember. Was the sword? I don't remember. Was the sword actually in the story, or did that come later? Do you remember, Anne? I'm trying to remember. Is it in the story, Michael?
It's at the beginning of the story.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, and because the sword does come up, that it was wiped of blood was one thing. There's the clock that was not part of this, but the clock was going backwards when the people got picked up, like they'd fallen back in time. That's another part of it. There was one where there was huge circles on the side of the ship, as if those were from tentacles of a giant beast. Was another one. That the Dea Gratia actually heard voices from the ship before they picked it up, and so that's why. And some claim that they could actually see, that they had actually seen people. They thought they saw images of people on the ship, but then when they got there, there was no one there. Lots of other like lit pipes, in ashtrays, and still like food that was warm to the touch. Lots of lovely wackadoodle theories. I mean, it just, again, it kind of just, it builds, right? It's kind of like, you tell a fish story and the fish gets bigger and bigger each time. Michael?
I don't know why I got this feeling as I was reading it, but the captain is an extreme religious man. And why he would have had his wife and a child on there when they were carrying very dangerous cargo, I'm not sure. But something about the story reminded me of the Georgetown massacre. Do you remember that, where the religious fanatic they all committed suicide, and those that didn't, they were killed off, which the idea of the sword there kind of reminded that the last one wiped the sword of the ones that wouldn't commit suicide, so they had to be killed.
I mean, there's
Is there any logic to that? It just, I mean, that would explain why it was a clean ship.
I mean, there's no evidence, you know. I would think the fact that the life, don't forget the lifeboat is missing, and so I would think the most logical explanation is for some reason they left the ship. You know, whether it was because of like the water spout theory, the explosion theory, your theory that maybe there was some religious reason or fanaticism. You know, for some reason they left that ship. I mean, there's no evidence that the captain, is there no evidence that he was,
No, I'm
was a
not
bad person, you know? So I want to be careful because I don't want to think, you know, because there's no evidence.
Well, but it was the sword idea that kind of made me, why was that wiped?
And I don't think that was in real life. I don't think
No,
that
that was Conan Doyle's story.
was Conan. And you know, I mean, when they found the Mary Celeste, it was sailing erratically, like it was completely out of control when they found it. It wasn't like the legends where like this thing sailing smoothly.
Yeah, the sails were in tatters. Yeah.
I mean, the one thing I think you could say, Michael, that maybe there is something to what, you know, maybe there is some kind of foul play afoot. Is the fact that where the Mary Celeste was like its route, if they were on course for their route, was what would be like being on I-25 in Colorado. It was a busy sea route, and it was a very busy shipping route. So there is something to the fact that, you know, if they did, and it might be like that's why they just got hopped in that boat, because they figured someone was going to come by and could rescue them. And maybe it was just a slow time in that route, and they got way off course. But you know, that's the only thing I could think of where we have some evidence where maybe something went wrong. What would you? Yeah,
kind of hard to believe because, you know, I'm thinking of Captain Bligh. How far did that man sail in a boat of that size?
That's right.
After the Bounty was taken over, and for that, well, the mutineers have the Bounty itself, but you know, these guys were great sailors. So
They sailed about 9,000 miles in that ship.
yeah, and you know, navigating on the fly. And I would assume that any sea captain at those days would have those skills.
Right.
Right.
I was just about to bring up that myself.
Yeah.
The other thing I found interesting, and I'd like to know, this first time I've read this story. So the trope of the missing part of the statue has been used again and again and again. And the one that jumped immediately to my mind is that there was a Superman episode with George Reeves where it wasn't an ear, it was a diamond that fell out of the eye of the statue into a pool in front of it. And they captured Clark and Lois and Jimmy, and they were going to kill them all. And then Clark tried to find the diamond in the pool and reached down, and he had a lump of coal in his pocket. So he squeezed it into a diamond, stuck it in the eye. And of course, the same thing happened that now, you know, they picked him up and carried him off and he was the king. But I wonder how many times that trope got used, and was Doyle the first one to use it, I wonder.
That's a good question.
That I don't know. I mean, I do know that there's a number of those Adventures of Superman radio programs and you know, TV show that were like kind of taking some Sherlock Holmes plots and twisting them around. I remember we mentioned that with the 6 Napoleons, that there was one that did it with like 6 monkey statues or something.
Yes.
It is possible that they were just Doyle fans.
Or lazy writers.
There's Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone, where the title jewel is from like a Hindu temple. And that was from, let me see, 1868, according to Wikipedia.
People say that's the first mystery novel.
Yeah, that's the first mystery novel.
That's right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I guess the trope. You know, the other trope is the missing ship and what happened to the missing ship. And Doyle wrote a story called, and I don't know if this is before this or after this, but he wrote a story called The Fate of the Evangeline, which I came across because I was doing some research for my local group, and there's actually a Sherlockian thing in that story, which I'll bring to your attention on Sunday. I won't say it now because there are some members around. But anyway, this could be a sequel article for you, Derek. It's called The Fate of the Evangeline, and it's another missing ship story with an explanation at the end, by the two survivors, the two people that survived, and so you might want to look maybe and see if that had some basis in truth. I don't know.
Larry, is that the one where there's a mention of rats like eating away at the ship?
I'm not. I think so.
I only asked because one of the and of course I have to go back and reread my article. But I remember one of the sources I looked at. They said that Doyle had written another ship story later where he mentions like rats eating away at the hull at one scene, and the theory is that one of the things he was hinting at was that was kind of like the Mary Celeste, that all these people were twisting the truth of the thing based on his story, and he was really upset eventually, as Anna said.
I did read it recently for that reason, and I do vaguely remember something about the rats. So
okay,
you may be right. I'd
have to double check.
Have to relook at it, but I only was able to read the story because I knew the source of the HCD encyclopedia, because I didn't have it in any of my books.
Okay.
When it was referred to, and I read it online as we did with this story.
Shauna, were you gonna sorry, Shauna, were you gonna jump in? It looked like you were gonna say something a minute ago.
Yeah, this is also my first time reading the story. I did not realize going in how much race would play a role in the plot. Because like our protagonist, he's a Civil War veteran. He was an abolitionist before that. He gets given this relic, this African relic by this enslaved Black woman, because she's like, all the other Black people around here are terrible, so I'm going to give this to you, white boy, because you seem to be cool.
Yeah, right.
And then the villain of the piece is, someone of mixed race descent who's been carrying on this one-man race war, and finally he's like, screw this, I'm going to go back to Africa and find some good Black people and just hang with them.
Right.
I did not anticipate any of that.
Not affiliated with Black Lives Matter, I'm sure.
Yeah. No, remember, he wanted to be their king. He wanted to be the king there. So
yeah,
he was not exactly. Yeah.
I do think it is interesting though that Doyle, I think he made the villain somewhat sympathetic because he had this horrible life. I mean, all these horrible things had happened to him. Not to say that his solution to become a serial killer and kill just white people is appropriate, but I mean, the fact is, he had every right to be angry. And I think in this time period, especially, and Doyle, with obviously some of the Sherlock Holmes stories, definitely was sympathetic, to the African-American cause here. Especially the yellow face in particular for the Sherlock Holmes story. And so I think that there is something to this, to that makes him, at least a more complicated character than just, I'm Goring as this completely bloodthirsty villain, which I appreciate that he made him a complicated character.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm wondering if that kind of doesn't tie in thematically with the choice of the name Habakuk for our protagonist, because it's such an odd name. So I looked it up, and it's a biblical prophet. And I only had a chance to kind of glance over the Wikipedia article, but apparently the point of that book is, God's choice of how he delivers justice, kind of the tools he uses, and the idea that, on the one hand, Goring is this awful murderer, but on the other hand, the fact that, he's got, some justification for what he does, that kind of uneasy, that question of, is he doing God's work or is he just a terrible person?
Anna, you mentioned that too in your talk a little bit. What did did you find the same thing?
Well, because he made him an abolitionist, I thought, he was trying to say God's not taking care of this problem. I'm going to help out a little bit, questioning why it's not being done. Yeah, that's how I took it. So I thought that was why he must have used the name, because it's such an odd name,
Yeah.
And the fact that his first name was Joseph, I think, right? The J was Joseph. So why not use the Joseph instead?
Right. And
I read it as a comment on the evil of slavery, because what had happened here is that a man turned evil in reaction to evil. You can't justify what Septimus did, because what he did was slaughter innocents based on race, and that's wrong no matter how you slice it. But it's evil begets evil, and that could be a theme that Doyle was trying to emphasize. You know, why do we, and remember that a lot of people in those days thought slavery was okay for a lot of reasons. So maybe he's showing you, here's a reason it's not. Here's something that can happen because you tolerate this evil, and it's a good reason to get rid of it.
Yeah, Edith pointed out, if you saw her note in the chat, that the story of the sea unicorn may have tied in with this. I was also thinking of the in Thor Bridge, the ship that's mentioned that disappeared into the mist and was never seen again, also is tying in with this story. You know, and I'm honestly glad we brought the story up, because there's so much with the legend of the Mary Celeste, which is so enjoyable to chat about, that I think in some ways the story gets lost in the discussion, because again, the legend is bigger than the story, and it's bigger than the truth. And it's just fascinating to talk about how this, you know, spun out of control, really. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time. Anybody could put a question in the chat, or if anyone wants to say one last thing, we do have a couple of comments that I want to mention next month's talk. Robin, you haven't chatted yet.
Just an observation that, knowing how often the sea and sailing gets mentioned in the canon, Glorious Glock, Black Peter, I wonder if Conan Doyle, when he wasn't thinking about Sherlock Holmes, he really wanted to write maritime mysteries and adventures.
He wrote a number of them. I mean, there are a couple. They're like the Pole Stars, another story he wrote, which is a ghost story. Yeah. All right. Shauna, were you going to say something else?
Yeah, there's a funny little kind of accidental semi-autobiographical element in the story, where part of the question that's raised early on is like, oh, there's a survivor. Why hasn't this guy come forward before? And his explanation is, well, I tried to tell my story, nobody believed me. And he mentions in particular, he got into an argument with his brother-in-law.
Yeah.
It struck me because in later years, you know, Arthur Conan Doyle got into an argument with one of his brothers-in-law because of his relationship with Jean Leckie. Right. And obviously he had no way of knowing about this when he wrote this story. I just thought that was a funny little accidental parallel with his real life.
Yeah, that's true.
Just on that, more on that point, there are a couple of points where he's talking about that story that I think come back again in The Man with the Watches. I don't know if you've read that as well.
Oh, yeah.
Brother and brother-in-law tension, and there are a couple of little things like that I think he picked up later on in that story, which is a weird one to bring it back in, because they're so unalike otherwise.
Yeah. And Brian put this in the chat, but the podcast Doings with Doyle, which every month they do a different Arthur Conan Doyle story, usually not a Sherlock Holmes story, but they did a really cool episode on The Man with Watches and the Lost Special, kind of tying them together. And then as we had our meeting a few months ago on the Lost Special, you know, are they really, you know, Sherlock Holmes stories? That's the big debate. All right, so this was this is one of those talks that just kind of makes my day. I love talking about this story. This is really great. This was a lot of fun, guys. So thank you all for coming. Next month we'll do a different one. Brian is going to do Sherlock Holmes in comics is going to be the topic, and kind of looking at comic book versions of Sherlock Holmes. You want to talk a little about that, Brian?
Yeah, well, by necessity, it will be an overview.
I have a lot of Sherlock Holmes comics I could share.
There are a lot of
I'll bring them along.
Oh, please do. Yeah, everyone want to show off their collections. I mean, that's part of the fun of being a Sherlockian, is that we all get to collect. And this is a great little untapped, undiscussed area of Sherlockiana, is all these wonderful stories that are out there since the days of the canon. So yes, I'm going to discuss a few. Because most Sherlock Holmes comics are still copyrighted, I cannot distribute a lot of the stories I wanted to, like the one where he meets the Joker. but there's a public domain story that I'm going to distribute, and there's another one, an indie one from the 90s, where I contacted the creator and he gave his permission for us to share it. So we'll be sending that out in a few weeks.
All right.
I'm looking forward to it.
All right, everyone. So thank you. Have a great, happy Easter for those of you who celebrate Easter, and have a great weekend and a great month. You know, hopefully we're all getting vaccinated and we're being safe out there. You know, how many of you guys are vaccinated now? I am.
I went the first one.
All right. It should be open up. I know it's for those of you, I only got it because I'm a teacher, so they let me. But in Colorado, they just open it up to everybody. And I know by the end of the month, I think everywhere it'll be open up to everyone. So hopefully, you know, stay safe, guys, and we'll keep it going.
Anna, thank you, Derek.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, guys. Anna, got another round of applause for Anna. It was an awesome talk. So
Thank you.
Great talk, Anna.
Thank you, Derek.
thank you, guys.
Thank you, Derek.
And I'll see you in May, and we'll talk about comic books, which will be kind of fun. So, all right.
All
So
right.
take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right.